Some of the most critical issues in the world today are linked with the way we govern natural resources. From Russia's war funded by oil revenues to the existential threat of climate emergency, many also relate to the commodities in the earth beneath us. For example, we want to transition to sustainable energy, so we reduce carbon emissions and fight the climate change that can lead to so many natural resources in the world. But to do that, for those renewable energies to scale, the extraction of certain minerals that are needed for them would have to scale as well. So the lithium, the cobalt that goes into the batteries of electric cars, just to name some. And that also comes at the expense of an enormous challenge to avoid that the extraction of those minerals have negative impacts on countries and communities and instead benefit them. So it seems like governing natural resources in a way that avoids funding the kleptocrats of the world or in a form that ensures communities and countries benefit from them is key. And today, many people and organizations work around ensuring this happens. But how all these organizations and people do we get here? In what we call the natural resource governance field. And where should we go given this new nature of the challenge that are emerging? Are the same policy recommendations of the past decades still relevant? Do we need to rethink our assumptions and how? Do we need other models, pathways, bolder ideas about what resource governance is about? I am Ana Carolina González, Senior Director for Programs at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. And these are the issues we at NRGI grapple with every day, and also in this podcast series, The Resource Remix. It is my pleasure to welcome to this podcast NRGI's former President and CEO, Daniel Kaufmann. Danny is a pioneer in the field of governance at the World Bank, now affiliated with the University of Philippines, the Brookings Institute, and Resourceful Development. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you very much, Ana Carolina. It's an enormous pleasure and honor to be with you and with the whole NRGI family again, and in such an important topic, which you have outlined.
Danny, I started by speaking about some of the critical current events related to resource governance. You have been writing and presenting about this seismic shift for the past few years. But for those of us with shorter memories, can you quickly get us to speed on what is meant by resource governance and where the field of resource governance came from?
Thanks. I'm glad by your inquiry into this historical perspective, not only because without history, we misunderstand the present and we will keep repeating past mistakes in the future, but also because it puts into context the sense that the field of natural resource governance is at the crossroads right now. You see, contrary to popular beliefs, concerns about natural resource governance, which refers to the good stewardship on the natural resource riches of a country for the benefit of all, for the growth, development, benefit of all, did not just start in the UK and with the likes of Tony Blair and others 2 decades ago. In fact, in the early 1700s, the British publication The Spectator wrote in an article, "It is generally observed that in countries of the greatest plenty, there is the poorest living." So this is a long-standing concern. The increasing traction to the idea that resources might be more of an economic curse than a blessing began to emerge in the 1950s and 60s with the analysis of challenges in developing countries. In the early 90s, there were writings already about how countries rich in resources were unable to use that wealth to boost their economies and how they got economic growth, and especially compared with non-resource rich countries. And then the likes of Jeff Sachs, other academics found a very strong correlation between natural resource abundance and poor economic performance. In the 60s, back to the 60s, thanks to the concerns in the Netherlands that they had just found plenty of natural gas and were earning fresh foreign exchange, a particular economic policy dimension of the resource course garnered attention, namely exchange rate overvaluation, which discouraged non-resource exports, the so-called Dutch disease. We can call this, complementing the early concern on resources negatively affecting economic growth, resource course 1.0. And we are talking more than half a century ago, the very economic manifestations of the resource course. Only after the turn of the century, that very economic focus begins to take also a governance dimension very seriously beyond traditional economics. Call it resource course 2.0. And we enter at that point this, what I would call the soft governance era, which focused very much on transparency in extractive, and particularly at the beginning, transparency of payments of industry to governments, to full disclosure to the extent possible, which still has not happened until today. NGOs like Global Witness were pioneers in this, later leads to the creation of Publish What You Pay. In this space, they influence the UK and eventually leads to the inception of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI, where we both work. And all this is also predecessor to the support given by NRGI at the time, which was called Revenue Watch Institute before we had the mergers. And obviously, Revenue Watch Institute, the predecessor of NRGI, plays an important role in this process as well. Then about a decade ago, the increasing realization that transparency may be absolutely necessary, but it's far from sufficient, results in increasing focus on participation and accountability, or what we call sometimes the TAP troika: transparency, accountability, and participation. Among others, the notion of protection of civic space becomes important, and we work hard for those protections to become institutionalized in initiatives like in the EITI and elsewhere. And that begins to happen. And the evidence did show that improved transparency, improved participation, accountability could help mitigate some forms of corruption. And that's all part of this governance resource course 2.0 package. But again, more recently, it becomes clear that this focus was also insufficient, leading to the case we have been making for broadening the governance scope in natural resource governance, sometimes called TAP+. So going beyond the TAP troika into very tough rule of law reform issues, regulatory reform issues, public sector reforms, state-owned enterprise reform, particularly with national oil companies, and very timidly, a very start with the so-called energy transition, okay? So in brief, that's where we are now, but with two pending key dimensions, which we can discuss later, of the resource course that we have not gotten the focus in the natural resource governance field that it deserves, even if there are some initiatives here and there, but the field as a whole. One, which we can call the resource course 3.0, and label it as the tough governance dimension, which is related, let's call it for what it should be called: tyranny, conflict, and climate crisis. And the other, RC 4.0 related, which is a corporate resource course. It's the corporate dimension of the resource course, the captors by industry and oligarchs and their collusion with the kleptocrats.
And it is very interesting, Danny, that you take us back to very early days in history on this discussion, because of course, when you discuss about natural resource governance, one might think that it all started at least with some emblematic initiatives or conversations. I remember in particular that report that Global Witness published in 1999, if you remember, denouncing corruption in Angola in the oil sector and demanding companies to actually disclose the payments that were been made to government as a sort of an incentive to avoid corruption, right? And then the emergence of Publish What You Pay, EITI, where NRGI actually took a very active part. But yes, a lot of things had happened. And although people is still, of course, interested in having information about these payments, what you see in the case of, let's say, popular consultations in mining regions in Colombia, or what you heard from local communities in South Africa that are asking for them to be included in just transition plans, is that people is no longer looking only for information, or even, as you mentioned, for transparency, accountability, and participation, is people is no longer looking even to hold governments and companies to account. They want to decide. They want to influence decision making. They want a share of power. So while we have made important gains in transparency around the extraction of oil, gas, and minerals, we clearly aren't where we need to be, right? And you have been promoting major change for some time already. But do you think organizations of the field are asking these fundamental questions? I know that you took the lead in designing and implementing a survey in which actually NRGI and 100 other participants took part precisely in relation to these. So, and you and a colleague are now having a report on it. So what have you found?
When we ask hundreds of respondents for what are the most important priorities for reform, generally, at first, some of these very tough governance dimensions that we just mentioned, including the protection of democracy, including addressing state capture and high-level corruption, and including the climate emergency, they all came out as a very high priority. That's not very surprising. But the same respondents are rather pessimistic about the likelihood of progress in those areas. There's a huge gap between stated priority and likelihood in their views. But that's not the case when we ask them questions about the traditional ongoing areas of work in the field, such as continuing the work on disclosures and transparency that started 20 years ago. They don't give it the absolute top priority, a bit lower, but the likelihood of being successful is fine. So consistent with that, there are lots of people in the field that are comfortable continuing with that trajectory because at least the probability of failure, since it's much lower hanging fruit, is lower. Then when we ask these respondents about what kind of transitions were needed in the various natural resources, those in the natural resource governance field were more gradualist and conservative regarding moving away from fossil fuels than those outside of the field, which is telling in itself. Surprisingly, regarding this set of findings, civil society respondents, because we asked all stakeholders, industry, government, international financial institutions, and civil society were involved. But civil society respondents, on average, were basically as risk-averse as the respondents from the other stakeholders, governance and IFIs. I mean, there's some small differences, but you don't find a huge difference there. There were some exceptions, of course. There are rays of hope. And in terms of some respondents wanted and believing that something bolder is possible and giving also bolder type of recommendations as to what to do ahead. On average, this is not universal, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but on average, that's associated with younger and female respondents, interesting enough. So that's a message right there. They were not the norm, though. The norm was risk aversion and comfort. So overall, we do find some risk aversion, a measure of conformism, one which is not really consistent with the seismic global shifts that are taking place that we have been discussing. So the case in the report for much more audacity associated with concrete and bolder change is being made.
You mentioned that the respondents in the survey highlighted, like it is, as you said, not very surprising that some of the main changes that are highlighted there are the effects of the COVID pandemic in the economy, and this unsettling that comes with not knowing what is going to happen with economy in producing countries. And also, of course, the climate crisis and the challenges that come with the energy transition, for example, for oil, gas, and minerals producing countries, because that's also consistent with what we have been observing in NRGI. And yeah, the rise in authoritarian regimes and the growing restrictions of civic space. But maybe a couple of additional changes that I would think are important to take into consideration, and maybe are related to what you mentioned about the different role young people and women can play, is that there is an important change in, and I'm observing as well, in terms of how the field can require multidisciplinary perspectives. And so the traditional organizations working mostly around resource governance, we need to add other movements to the conversation, right? We need to build bridges with other movements, with the climate movement, with the human rights organization, with tax organizations and others, because the challenges that we are facing today are so systemic that require us to build coalitions out of the traditional actors in what we call the natural resource governance fields. And even beyond them, I would say that something that the actors in the field might need to do as well is we need to acknowledge that with the social protests that of the last years, an important number of new actors of social movements have emerged also in producing countries, even in the context of these deep restrictions to civic space. So even with people, knowing that it's difficult to participate, but wanting to participate more. So women organization, youth organization, indigenous and peasants organization, or more grassroots movements and networks, they operate very different from NGOs, but they are key actors when we think about how to make change happen. So I think that's one thing I would like to stress. There is a need to build bridges also with these social movements. And on the other hand, another change that I think has happened and requires the field to kind of be bolder is that when we think about the actors that we need to target to push for change, of course, the state, the public sector remain key and central. And we know that we need bolder strategies to target private sector, as you mentioned, like the corporate sector responsibility on resource governance and international institutions for change. That's not very new either. But sometimes we might have overlooked the role of media and narrative, not just to disseminate information. It is not just about influencing decision makers, but to influence public narrative, the way people see natural resources playing in their countries, in their territories, the power of moving the needle in the public opinion to then create a stronger and maybe longer term incentive for decision makers to act. For example, how to influence the narrative of the global energy transition that is mainly driven by the global north to include the voices of producing countries, to push for more concrete commitments in terms of climate finance, so we ensure the energy transition is actually possible in those countries as well. But for that, you need to shape narratives at a wider level, and strategic communications and alliance are key for that. But so based on what you've mentioned and what I have added, it looks like we might need some more paradigmatic change here. How we could make this possible, especially given what you've mentioned in terms of some risk aversion between organizations in the field and between other actors in the field. What are the opportunities that you see, but also the barriers that we might need to overcome? We have been recently discussing in NRGI about encouraging such a discussion, but what do you think are the elements we should consider?
Need to consider a bolder approach. Whether that will signify paradigmatic change or not, that's for another podcast. So let me give a few just ideas, suggestions that come up that I would ask, why aren't we making more progress and now? You mentioned multidisciplinary approaches. Well, this has been taking place for a long time, and now more is needed. Nobody will disagree with that. But the bolder version of that in the current situation is to say we need the most extreme form of partnership, both in terms of not only discipline, but in terms of also the focus on good research and analysis and activism. The most extreme form of partnership is a merger. We did one almost 10 years ago now, from Revenue Watch to Revenue Watch plus the Natural Resources Charter became NRGI. But they're extremely rare. The incentives in the field among NGOs, media, yes, more user-friendly storytelling and all that. That's very nice, and we have been discussing that for a very, very long time. But right now, as we see in the world, and in the worst governed places regarding hydrocarbons and so on, we need to protect and to support the toughest type of investigative journalism, right? And to get these stories out in places where everything is being banned, everything is being secret, and journalists are being put in jail. But in addition, why not consider a major scaling up in addressing the huge remaining misgovernance within fossil fuels themselves, due to the actions and capture by big oil, by the kleptocrats, by the rulers of oil-rich countries? That's really tough. And how do we do it? It's a different discussion. There are some staff in NRGI and other places that are working on that, but these are niche issues. These are not being integrated into the core of what the field should be doing. Why also don't we fully expose, without mincing words? We have to use a different language, the massive greenwashing in the whole ESG industry by the corporates, with which we can discuss at very much less. Then take the national oil companies. Why continue to fiddle at the margin regarding taking a little measure here or there on additional disclosure and a few changes in corporate governance, when some of them are totally captured politically, and rather it's high time, it's been high time for years to consider a very different model in those settings, even if that's very politically difficult, instead of trying the same reforms at the margin in places, in organizations, institutions that may be unreformable.
Maybe also that I would add, Danny, is in terms of having the conversation, I totally agree with you. This is about having a conversation and a podcast, but it cannot be just that, right? So it's about who participates in the conversation and the form it takes. And again, who participates in the conversation, we need new voices. We need additional voices to the ones that have traditionally been associated with debates about natural resource governance, including people in other fields, social movements, universities in the Global South think tanks, and journalists as actors. They are not just targets for us, as you say, to disseminate information, etc. They are very important actors in the field as well. But in relation to the how do we get there? How do we promote this change that the field is needing? It is, how to take these conversations that are happening maybe in podcasts or in many interesting meetings here and there to specific contexts. What if we have this conversation in a specific territories, in specific countries? And if we look even for experience in which those changes are already at play in the way organizations, communities, or other actors are pushing for resource governance in this new era, a sort of bottom-up approach to learning, to understanding what does resource governance mean today. And what if we learn also from other movements? We are not the first movement to face the need for a change. Like human rights movement also have faced many change in the last decades. And what if we pilot as we learn new ways of understanding this natural resource governance, and use innovative ways, again, to communicate and provide visibility to the process and to specific efforts that maybe are, small, or we don't know them yet. What if we provide some visibility to those? So it's less about big words and more about interesting, even if so small actions.
In terms of very concretely speaking, and the whole issue of bringing in different voices and addressing this problem of state capture, let me mention just two very concrete examples, and the field could engage more with. One is my own country, Chile, with a newly elected youngest president in the world, Boric, and so on. They are basically grappling with that. But at the same time, a new constitution is being drafted. We don't know yet. It's going to be approved by the whole population and so on, but it's being drafted in the most participatory manner ever of any constitution anywhere. So we're having that as we speak. Now, Chile is the #1 producer of copper in the world and so on. So it will be extremely fertile to collaborate with that case study and draw the lessons of, yes, the art of the possible in this context.
I think I also remained positive about what can come. It's not easy. Path dependency is always there. This idea of continue doing what you know how to do, what you have been doing for so long. But I think that the time has come in which we need to be bolder and think about other layers, because the challenges are just so huge that we definitely need to build bridges with other movements and see how to push change forward. But the problem is also that the context might not be helping that much. So what do you think about the impact of the war in Ukraine, and how do you see these new trends in the international commodities market, energy markets, can actually maybe delay or maybe be an opportunity for this conversation and this major change to materialize?
At the end of the day, it's a question of mindset and preparedness to take risks. Because one way of looking at what's happening now is to say that there have been extremely adverse developments, and we know what they are. You have mentioned them. We have written about that. So it's a time to protect former gains, hunker down, and be very careful about going in directions of trying to address the enormity of these new challenges, because politically they may be intractable. The probability of success is much, much less, obviously, than protecting early gains and continue to work on what we are accustomed to win. So that would be a safer, risk-averse way. The other is to say, maybe continuing to do the same may be safer, and we will not have a huge failure, but the impact is going to be so small, and we're going to become irrelevant given the new developments. So there's absolutely no choice but to consider a strategy with much more audacity and boldness. And then the question becomes what to address. Let's face it, and I mentioned and hinted to that earlier, we are in an era now, and you mentioned the war context, Putin's invasion into Ukraine. We are in an era which has become very clear that there are hydrocarbon-fueled wars and invasions of other countries. So this is so well beyond these soft notions of governance that we need more transparency than in the past. So the notion, that's a completely different dimension of the resource course and so on. Because of that, we know that there are major, not just the climate crisis challenge that we all know, and it's been ongoing and it's becoming worse, but there are major energy security considerations. As a result, many other countries in Europe and others are not only considering, but are approving really fast major new investment plans, and also because the oil and gas prices have gone through the roof. So NRGI and others could be monitoring this a huge uptick of proposals and actions in terms of more, not less, new investments in hydrocarbons, and particularly LNG and so on. And obviously, there are enormous trade-offs with energy security and so on. There is a bit less of a discussion because politically it's so difficult to say, no, this is absolutely disastrous for the climate crisis. So at the end of the day, I mean, we have to put it very starkly. At the end of the day, countries are going to face either with stranded assets or with a climate catastrophe. So those are two choices, unless we do something really, really boldly. And just calling into action and showing with the numbers what that is happening, and showing the differences, what can be done next year versus the next 5 years is really important. And that's why I put into the mix, we have to discuss issues like nuclear power. We also have to discuss demand destruction. I mean, again, it's a political taboo in the United States, the carbon tax and so on. But basically, the obsession with oil consumption has to basically shift. And it's beginning to shift in some countries. In fact, some European countries have been decarbonizing relatively quickly. And now, again, talking about examples, concrete examples. We are not talking enough about great examples in Africa. In terms of what they are doing, the share of electrification with renewables in Kenya, thanks to major wind and solar projects, the African Development Bank is involved. There are a number of other examples. Instead, we focus so much on how much they're going to lose in revenues if they don't produce as much in terms of oil. Of course, we have to be mindful these countries are not the main producers of carbon emissions. So that's not where most of the problem, and they did not benefit from hydrocarbons like the West did. So there is issue of climate justice. But because of that, my suggestion for a topic that should take much more prominence is major compensation mechanism. A Marshall Plan-like type of mechanism may be needed. Already, again, there is a concrete example, what some European Union and Canada countries did with $8 billion to South Africa so that they started phasing out of coal, for instance, happened just a few months ago. So again, this is not academic or things like that, but these are the type of very concrete areas to make a change. And we need to think big and say, how do we scale up this? What would be the proposal? If we're going to have audacity and try really new things, we're going to take risk and we're going to fail as well as succeed. So we don't want to fail on everything. And that's a difference of mindset that needs to be changed. And that's why the fresh blood, the new voices, having very, very tough and frank conversation with boards and with funders is very important at this stage. The world has changed dramatically.
So one of the things that you mentioned about the impacts of the war in Ukraine and the need to monitor what is happening out there in terms of new investments and new plans to actually expand gas and oil exploitation here and there is something that we have been following very closely, especially because this raised a lot of expectations in producing countries. And you have seen already a lot of countries in Africa like Tanzania or Senegal, just mentioning the possibility of expanding their oil gas fields to be now providing the European market with their gas. And of course, there are a lot of things to put on the table to discuss this that we don't have time to discuss, but we have been monitoring these. And one of the things that we have recommended in our reports and blogs is that Europe needs to be clear about these and needs to make bolder commitments in terms of not only providing its continent with the energy that it deserves, so energy security being prioritized, but also ensure that energy transition in those countries is not delayed because of these new move. And so I think that what you mentioned about the need of climate finance to be much more deliberated and meaningful and intentional about really moving the needle on energy transition in those countries is very important. And the other thing I wanted to mention is it's also about the model, because if we want to just expand renewable energies or other type of exploitation of critical minerals to provide those renewable energies with, in the same way that we have developed in the last 3 or 4 or 5 or decades, it is just not going to be possible. So we need to listen to other movements. We need to listen to the climate movement, but we need to listen to the communities that are proposing new development models as well, right? And to examine also our consumption patterns and see how these can be modified, how we can learn from others as well. But
you said,
this is just to say,
you said we need to listen. I would say we need to merge.
That too, yeah, definitely. I mean, we start by listening, and then we need to merge and to build bridges and to build coalitions, as I said. So, yes. Thank you, Donnie. This has been a great conversation. Definitely not the last one on this topic. It is clear from what we have discussed, at least, that our thoughts align in terms of the need for a bolder change. I would call it for maybe a new resource governance paradigm or different paradigms around natural resource governance emerging from different contexts and different regions, etc. But definitely something that put politics in the center of it, that build bridges across movements and across social movements and sectors and perspectives, and a natural resource governance framework, at least, that includes the tough reforms that are needed, as you mentioned, including, of course, being more intentional about fighting kleptocracy and ensuring that people have a place in the table in decision making. So thanks for this, and I hope we'll have the time to continue this conversation and others in other Resource Remix podcasts.
And thank you very much.